we're in.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Olney. James Wilde, MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to talk a little bit more about the kind of lessons learned from the supplier exit and how we kind of move forward from here. And Citizens Advice has said that Ofgem allowed unfit and unsustainable energy companies to trade with little penalty, which we've covered a little bit in here. I mean, how are you going to ensure that the reforms you've talked about, some of which you get to clarify which are actually in force and which are proposals you're consulting on, will actually make a difference to how you regulate suppliers?
So I'll ask Neil to come in on the detail, but the central part of it for me is number one, capital adequacy. Do you have enough money or enough risk management in your business to make sure you can survive a much wider range of scenarios? Secondly, we are applying a fit and proper test that says people who have been involved in the market that did run some of those business models that were not responsible are not able to come into the market again. And then thirdly, we have a series of compliance reviews that make sure that companies are treating their customers fairly according to the rules in a number of different areas. Now, in terms of where we are, we're enforcing against those rules already. In terms of rules that are being developed and under consultation, that point I made around two things, around moving to the prudential regime and around ring-fencing customer credit balances, so the customer money, as well as the renewables money, are things that we are in discussion with the industry at the moment.
So just to add to a few examples of some of the things we are already doing while we wait for some of the consultations to finish and then enact that. We've done our first version of stress test. We've issued a stress test version 2 that will come out before this winter, so we're confident around the levels of resilience that all suppliers in the market have got. We've mentioned the compliance reviews. There's a market-wide review of fit and proper to make sure that we're absolutely certain that everybody in this industry has passed that test, and indeed the suppliers are following the rules, as well as further market-wide compliance reviews on things like risk management. It's the job of those reviews. They're really invasive. They're a really good tool because they're aiming to drive standards up across the industry, which is what we want to do on behalf of consumers.
And how does that capital adequacy approach compare to other European markets and the requirements that exist there?
So most European markets don't have the same sort of retail market that we do. So a lot of companies are vertically integrated. And indeed, a lot of companies are either state-owned or price-regulated from the top, and so they don't have the distinction that we do between the two markets. The best benchmark I can find really is the banking sector that we have here, because that has the same kind of structure and some similar risks. The one thing I do need to emphasise, though, we've talked a lot about the things that we are doing, and both to enforce and to redesign the regulations. We are still in the middle of this massive sort of changing costs that we've seen. So this is going to be a balancing act for the industry itself to both recapitalise at a time when costs are going up and customers are under a great deal of pressure. So we are going to need to adapt to make sure that we don't inadvertently push companies out of the market and therefore cause customers more cost, but equally keep a tough and resilient regime that makes sure, as best we can, we move the market from where it is today to one that could survive shocks more broadly. And there are some big trade-offs there. So, for example, we issued a provisional order to a company to say to them, you can't take on new customers, you can't pay your shareholders until you change. If they don't change, the only option for us then is to take their licence away, which will cost customers some money, but less money than leaving them to trade in the market.
Just on the trade-offs, obviously you've got resilience, you've got competition, you've got innovation, different things. I mean, is Ofgem geared up to do this? Looking at the Auxera report, it raised concerns about silos and frictions within the organisation on information flows to actually look at the trade-offs. So what changes have you made in response to that report to actually do that work?
Well, there's three areas. I mean, Chair, you mentioned risk management, for example. We are looking not only in retail but across the board at what are the more extreme edge scenarios, and we are wargaming those much more intensively than we used to. What Auxera said to us, though, was although we were doing cost-benefit analysis on policy by policy, they didn't feel we had a robust enough framework to draw out the trade-offs, for example, between competition and innovation. So last week, as part of a sort of piece on market reform, we set out our view of what those trade-offs should be and how we were going to assess them. Now, that becomes one framework across our regulatory piece that allows us not to look at an individual policy, but the policies as they aggregate together. And thirdly, we are designing a different operating model that reduces the silos and makes sure that we, in a sense, build in collaborative working as part of the way we run ourselves, and that's something that's ongoing.
Okay, obviously in the face of the number of failed companies, inevitably there are calls for massive new regulation to come in. how are you going to guard against that knee-jerk call for regulation, which may well be over the top compared to we've had this black swan event in terms of the energy prices going up. Do we need to completely change the thing, moving to the whole financial service regulation you're talking about? That sounds to me like quite a heavy-handed approach to regulation. Is that actually justified, and how are you balancing that out?
So look, well, this is an ongoing conversation we have with our board, and what I say to them is this is not something you design and you leave. You need to put the limits in place that you think you need for the market today, and you need to see what impact that has. So is that addressing the financial resilience problems that we've seen? But equally, if we find that nobody enters the market, or we find that the independents aren't able to survive in this market, you need to change and adapt that regulation over time. And that's why this wider framework, this thing that we published last week that sets out our goals and objectives, becomes a really important tool to make sure we're testing ourselves, not only to make sure we're delivering on one objective, but we're looking at all the objectives across the piece. And in that way, I expect us to develop what we can see. And to emphasise, my board and the industry don't want a sector that is so regulated we don't see change. We can't afford that.
One of the companies that came into the market as a challenger, Octopus, has given evidence to us in terms of your approach on ring fencing, where they're very critical about what you're proposing to do, and estimate that actually if you took an arrangement similar to ATOL or Financial Services Compensation Scheme, the cost to consumers of putting such a system in place would be 7 to 15 times less than what you're actually proposing. How do you respond to that?
So that's probably known to this committee. This is a matter of huge controversy across the industry. There are others who are saying, we should be doing this immediately. In a sense, the way we're thinking about this is twofold. So one is to protect customer money, to make sure that customer money is not disappearing and having to be replaced by those of us who pay our bills in the future. But the second, equally importantly, is to look at the moral hazard in the market. So to make sure that if you're a small supplier coming into the market today, you don't have this incentive to keep growing, and by keeping growing and offering low tariffs, you can survive as long as you grow long enough. And what Auxera said to us was that was one of the factors, or one of the models that contributed to the failures we saw last year. So what we've done is we published our analysis that says, by and large, we think this is a cost-effective measure, and we've asked the industry for what their alternatives can be. But this is a really good example where we're going to have to get that balance right, and that's why we're consulting rather than simply putting rules in place.
When would you expect to take decisions on that?
So I would expect to do that early in autumn this year.
Right, okay. And Mr. Lawrence.
How long will it take to kick in if you make the decision on that?
So we have statutory timetables, so you need to consult statutorily, and then the decision has a 51-day standstill period, so early next year.
Is that just to refer to the evidence that Mr. James Wild referred to? This is Octopus estimate saying we estimate, that's Octopus, that the impact of implementing this policy, that's the ring fencing of credit, would drive up the annual customer bill by around £15. So that's on your mind, clearly, from what you said to Mr.
Absolutely, but just to sort of take step back out of that example, we do need companies to hold more capital. Now, that does mean there will be a pressure on bills, but the counterfactual is the cost of failure that we've seen. So we need to get the balance right between the two things. The other thing I should emphasise is that one of the things we asked the industry about was transition. So this may not be introduced fully on day one. This may be a transition over time.
Thank you, Mr. Wild.
Okay, another one of the proposals you put forward, the market stabilisation charge. Again, Martin Lewis, Money Supermarket expert, has been highly critical about that, and maybe we're looking forward to that hopeful time where wholesale costs drop a lot so that you can actually, this would actually kick into play. But again, are you worried that you're overreacting to a scenario which in the current circumstance seems reasonable, but actually in the longer run could actually act against competition incentives?
No, I'm actually not worried in this case because of the situation we're seeing before ourselves. So, we've talked about a rise of 6 times the normal price last year, 10 times the normal price today. We're seeing prices in the winter market that we've never seen before in the industry. That's already baked in. Now, in that scenario, in those circumstances, you broadly plan against 3 different scenarios. So 1, where prices get even higher, where the market gets tighter. 2, where you stay roughly where you are today, but you have a volatile prices. And 3, where prices drop dramatically and go back to the level they were before. Let's say, it may feel unlikely, but if there were an outbreak of peace in Russia, Ukraine, and the trading circumstances unwound. Now, the best thing we think companies can do for their customers is to forward hedge now. So it's to lock in the prices in the market so we don't expose customers to huge increases later on. But if they do that and you enter that third scenario of prices falling, that is going to be a huge challenge to their financial resilience. So to say to companies today, you need to hedge, which is what we're doing, we've had to put the market stabilisation charge that says we're going to basically allow this market to transition back to normality over time, knowing that that won't put them at risk of failure. So although I know we've had criticism from Martin Lewis and some quite direct criticism to Ofgem, I think Martin hasn't looked at the whole piece, and the trade-off here is not between a world where you have the stabilisation charge or not. It's a world where you have more failures than you need and therefore more cost.
Okay, you mentioned hedging, and one of the issues is at the moment when companies go into insolvency, administrators could monetize the hedging contracts that companies might have, but none of that flows beyond creditors. So what change are you looking at to prevent potentially even the shareholders of those businesses benefiting from that when it's the taxpayer who's picking up the cost of a lot of this?
So look, this is a matter of concern for us. So we have put forward as part of our package of measures 2 regulatory proposals that would potentially require companies to put in place trust arrangements that would allow the money from those hedges to transfer over to supplier of last resort. Now I have to say, and we've made this point sort of clear publicly, that we're testing those out and they may not work. And again, if they don't work, we may need to look towards legislation to resolve this. What I would like to see is that any asset left in a residual company should have a call against it if customers are paying somewhere else for the residual costs of that failure. So ultimately, we would like the supplier of last resort, the company that picks up those customers, to be a creditor to the administrator, to be able to challenge other creditors for those assets.
Could you do that within your existing powers, or would that, as it goes into insolvency, would it require legislative change?
So we're testing our existing powers, but if they don't work, we do think you need legislation, and we do think this needs to be fixed.
Okay. Mr. Lawrence, from your perspective, what does healthy competition look like in this market? How many suppliers would you like to see? What rate of return would you like to be seeing them earning?
Such an open question. I mean, what we really want is a competition for consumers. The number of suppliers really isn't the metric. I think it's what the outcomes that are being driven for consumers. So if we look at the framework that we've outlined, our customers getting fair prices, are we driving that transition to net zero with whatever the market looks like in the future from where we are now? Are the quality and standards right in the industry? That's really the metrics we need to look at. I don't think it's a numbers question, and it's difficult to comment on a number, a guess of a number, given the situation that we're in today and where we may transition to.
I think something that Auxerra said to us that I think has changed our approach is there was a focus on switching as the metric that allowed you to see how healthy the market was. I think we need to be broader in the way we assess our market arrangements to include the financial resilience of the market, and indeed to include thinking not only about price but about service standards and other things for those customers who don't move very often. And really part of that is this transition we're in and the work we're doing to change the price cap and run the compliance reviews, and part of that is the retail strategy that Joanna outlined earlier.
Okay, and how are you going to ensure that you continue to get innovation into the market? How's that going to be factored into your trade-offs of wanting to encourage new models, net zero related business models?
It all comes back to that adaptive nature of the framework we put in place. So we have to make sure that we continue to get entry. We have to make sure that we are seeing competition between incumbents, and we have to make sure that we are allowing a market to develop new and changing tariffs, coming back to where we started, that allow people to get the rewards for using their energy at different times. Now, we want to set up a set of monitoring arrangements that not only looks at the financial resilience of the companies, but allows us to test those other things as well. And I don't think we're talking about setting up a system and leaving it rigid. It's one that needs to change and adapt over time. And as we get to that future world, I think that the sorts of tariffs we have, the sorts of things we're going to need in this new market, yes, I believe there'll be pricing regulation, but I think it may look quite different.
And what steps have you taken and what action have you taken against businesses who have been holding excessively high direct debit levels and requiring excessively high direct debit amounts from customers? Have you taken enforcement action against them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a market-wide compliance review off the back of our own data that showed that there was concern on direct debits earlier this year. There's an invasive review, so we looked at the arrangements that every supplier had in place across their management control framework to make sure they drove the outcome for customers, as well as looking at the data underneath direct debits. We've completed that review. We'll do an announcement shortly in the public eye, but all suppliers have been contacted. We have a range of suppliers which we would call in the enforcement zone. There are two, and we're going to take them through to enforcement action off the back of it. We've got a range of suppliers in an amber zone, and they have to give us improvement plans, and they have to go and check all the direct debits that they've checked, the increases that are excessive. They've checked those, and they really are within the bounds. And we'll keep monitoring that, and that shows the power of this review. It's caused a lot of angst with suppliers, but we believe it's the right thing to do on behalf of customers to push the standard up in the industry. So it's been a really, in my view, a successful exercise at this point.
And we'll be making an announcement in the next few days.
Protecting consumers obviously at the top of your statutory objectives. So it's a bit concerning to read the advice from Citizens Advice, where they say that Ofgem's repeatedly failed to act on information from Citizens Advice on consumer experience and evidence of potential licence breaches by suppliers, particularly around telephone support and billing. Am I wrong to be surprised that less than 40% of Ofgem's compliance and enforcement cases over the last 3 years focused on consumer experience?
Well, just to say, the Market Meltdown report that was released last year highlighted a set of things that we think are really important, and as we've made a set of changes as a result of Citizens Advice evidence and indeed the evidence we've seen in the market. We've talked about that around financial resilience. There are some areas I don't agree with them, and one area is the number that you quoted, and the other area is the success or otherwise of Ofgem's compliance and enforcement regime. So two metrics I would look at: the level of fines we've issued across the industry over the last 10 years, which are significantly higher today than they used to be. But secondly, we need to remember the retail market is one part of this market. We also need to enforce against network companies, and I'll come on to some examples around that, and also generators who are taking money unfairly out of the market. So yes, we have a range of compliance and enforcement cases, but when you've got the residual impact of Storm Arwen, when you've got customers left off power for 9 days, that in my mind is as important as some of the retail issues that we've seen. So I think actually there is more to do, particularly if we're going to monitor supplier financial resilience, but it's an area where Ofgem has to focus across the market rather than on one particular part.
Okay, Mr. Lawrence, you talked a bit about the enhanced monitoring that's now in place. I mean, what's that telling you about the current state of the market? Should we be being prepared for further companies to go bust?
Well, it wouldn't be right for me to speculate in this forum about who's going to exit the market, but as Jonathan's already said, we are still facing a period of high and volatile prices, way in excess of things that we've seen before. And that's, we'll utilise our monitoring to monitor companies, but we know the risk is high.
Yes, I mean,
Can I just remind us how many are left in the market?
26 domestic suppliers, 26 domestic suppliers left in the market, but there's that's the total number, obviously.
That's including the big ones.
Yeah, a small number have a significant market share. Yeah.
But it is worth making that point. So we're not out of this yet. So this is not a sort of retrospective look at last winter. We are still in this change, and we have all our sort of enforcement and procedures ready and in place, but it's still a challenging market, so it's quite possible we see further excess.
What can you actually do if you discover there's another bulb out there or another business that's got an excessively risky approach? What can you actually do to prevent their demise, or can you do nothing?
So there are a series of things you can do. So number one, we talked about the monitoring and compliance reviews that we run and the stress tests that we run. Number two, you limit the activity of that company when you find out they have a problem, and we've issued orders that do that. Number three, you can work with that company to understand the impact our wider regulations are having on their finances, and there may be things you can do, for example, the time it takes to transition to the new regime. But number four, and this is really difficult, if we don't think they can survive, if we don't think they are going to stop taking unnecessary risks with customers' money, ultimately we have to take the licence away.
And how many of those 26 have got customer continuity plans in place?
I'll have to give you the exact number on customer continuity plans. We are doing the customer service market compliance review to actually look at detail at those plans. So I think the binary, have they got one or not, isn't the issue here. It's how good it is and whether it will stand up to scrutiny.
You're checking, you're making sure it's not just a tick box exercise.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Final couple from me, Chair. Clearly, the number of companies that's failed has created problems for existing suppliers for transferring. What are you going to do if there's further failures and other suppliers are not prepared to take on customers?
So as I think was mentioned in an earlier part of the session, we do have the powers to compel companies to take on customers. Now, we do need to do that. Part of the criteria for that is being mindful of the situation, both operationally and financially, for that supplier. But in a sense, we have found, during the solar process, actually suppliers have come forward, and we've had a very constructive relationship with the industry about sharing some of the operational burdens of some of the failures that we've seen. So we have a good relationship with the remaining suppliers. We are working closely with them, but ultimately we do have powers of mandation if we think we need them.
Presumably that's all the biggest suppliers that can absorb people more quickly.
Yes, I mean, they're operationally they're much more capable of absorbing people.
Well,
Yeah, thanks, Chair. But you've got powers to compel, but you may decide you can't do that because they can't financially take that. So, Ms Mumby, what provisions have you got in place? What agreements have you got with the Treasury for additional funding if they have to use the administration regime?
I mean, ultimately, exactly as you say, just to be clear, if it wasn't possible to make the supplier of last resort process work, then exactly in the way that we've done for Bulb, we would be into the world of a special administration regime. We're not currently expecting to stand up that process.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying the close working between Ofgem and BEIS over the last 6 months has meant we both make sure that risks are highlighted and understood, and we've been working to make sure that if there is an event, we're ready for it, and that's what we did with Bulb.
Sorry, just to clarify, Ms Mumby, you said you're not expecting it, but are you preparing for it?
Well, I think we've just had an excellent drill, so I think we're feeling pretty prepared.
Okay, that's confidence. Just to finish up on the funding points that were raised earlier, I think figures provided, from your annual reports by the NAO highlight the budget's gone up from £59 million in 2016-17 to £76 million in 2021. You talked about putting in a higher bid. Obviously, you're funded by the companies that you regulate, so ultimately that's a cost that will go on to consumers. Could I just clarify, you were talking about increasing the costs of those businesses rather than asking for a separate funding pot from the Treasury?
So the funding we would ask for the financial resilience measures is regulatory funding, so it would come from the levy that we charge across the industry. It's worth noting that a large part of our budget is directly funded from Treasury, and that's around administering government schemes.
Okay.
thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr. Wilde. Mr. Dan Carden, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just